Hi everybody, my name is Rich Helvey. I'm the lead animator for Access Hollywood over at NBC. Today I bring you the grand design. And in this DVD we're not going to be using Lightwave and delving into the real technical aspects of how to create a flying logo. But what we're going to do is we're going to use Lightwave as a creative experimental tool to help you take your client's original artwork and bring it to life and make it something special that really embodies the feel that they're looking for. And along the way we're going to be throwing out a few tips and tricks that maybe you haven't heard of before, and you're going to learn how to let your creative mind just work on a logo and really get it just right. So let's get started. Alright, even if you don't do these regularly yourself, at some point in time, if people in your family or your friends, if they know that you do any kind of motion graphics or anything like that, if you're any way video inclined, somebody's going to ask you to shoot their wedding and make a wedding video for them. So I'm not here to tell you how to do that, but I'm going to tell you how you can use Lightwave in a way that still kind of corresponds with the feeling that you're going to want to get out of a wedding video. You're not going to want big blocky type with lots of sparks and flames and stuff like that. That's not, you're going to have the bride taking your head off if you give her something like that. You want something soft and gentle and slow moving, nothing too dramatic or exotic or anything like that. A lot of what people do is they have drifting type and lots of blurs and things like that, and Lightwave will enable you to actually get that. It's and it'll do it in a way that I don't think anyone is going to be expecting exactly. So let me load up an object that I made. It's for a fake wedding. Emily and Jason are getting married, so they've asked me to do this. And so we'll open this up, and this is just their names spelled out, Emily and Jason. No big deal. Depending on what your wedding video is, you'll generally have their name, maybe you'll have the date that they got married, something like that. In this case, what I've done is I've taken, let's switch to front face so we can see. I've taken every letter and I've made a separate object out of it, and I've set the center point, the pivot point, roughly in the center of the object. You'll see why later. The other thing I've done is I've made one reference that is the whole thing spelled out. Now, if I'm looking through the camera at this, and we're looking at the reference, it's nice and neat, and all the individual letters line up. For this trick, we're going to be using digital confusion, which is a method that Lightwave uses to sort of fake depth of field. And it's really pretty quick, and it'll give us some neat blurring options. And we're going to do some tricks with having each letter separate so that we can control what we're blurring and what we're not. So let's look at it from the top view. We're going to take every letter, and the E is going to start. It's going to stay there. We're going to take every other letter and move it back. We're going to move it back 1 meter for each letter. So there's the M. Now it goes back 2 meters, 3, 4. Okay, now if we look through the camera again, you see all the letters are, they're now staggered. That's not really what we want. We want the letters to look like they're still lined up flat. So we're going to turn off Z on everybody so we don't accidentally move them from the positions we've just set them. Okay, and then we'll go through each letter and we'll reposition it so it fits, and we're going to size them all up a little bit. Now, you want to get it as close as you possibly can, but you're never going to get it quite perfect. So don't stress over it too much, but you want to just get them to be overlapping as much as physically possible. And you can see why I moved the pivot points, because we want to have these objects, you know, scaling up around their own centers. Otherwise this would be impossible to do. Also, you want to make sure that if you're doing this for people with short names. Bob, that's good. You don't want to do this for, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, because it's a little tedious setting this up. But I think that the results are actually are really worth it. Also, don't be afraid to use this elsewhere. You don't have to do this trick just for wedding videos. Okay, so that's pretty close. Let's take the reference here. We're going to hide it real quick. And we're going to turn off the check mark so it's not going to render. We will still leave it in the scene so that we can always come back to it if we need to remember where things were located. But for now, we're going to just make it so it's non-existent. Alright, now we're looking, and look at all these individual letters. And they look like they're in the right place. They certainly line up with the reference. But if you'll notice, we go to a different view, they're completely staggered, and each one is just a little bit bigger than the last one to make up for the fact that it's, you know, farther back in space. All right, now for the tricky bit. We're going to add a null, and we're going to call this focus. And we'll go to the Scene tab, Image Processing. Let's find the image filter for digital confusion. Go in there, and we're going to set the autofocus to focus. Let's make the lens f-stop 0.02 should be pretty good. Turn off render hidden geometry, and that's good enough for now. Now, what this is going to do is, here's our camera. Here's our camera. Here's our focus null. This is going to set the depth of field so that anything that is as far away from the camera as the null is going to be in focus. Anything that's farther or closer than that null is going to be out of focus, depending on how close it is. So right now, if we're looking at it, and let's take this light and just get it out of the way so we don't have to look at it. Scale this down. Alright, let's do a render and see what we're looking at. So first it lays it all out, and then digital confusion has an effect. Now notice that the null is at the same distance, roughly, from the camera as the E in Emily is, while the N in Jason is much farther away. And you can see it's definitely dropping off out in the distance. Now if we take that null, and over the course of, say, 60 frames, if it were to move from the same distance as the E all the way to the same distance that the N in Jason is, now when we render, the end of Jason is in focus, and the Emily is faded out. And if we were to take the null and actually move it closer and farther away at its two extremes, it's going to start off with everything out of focus, and it's also going to end with everything out of focus. And you might need to send it a little farther away just to make sure that everything gets out of focus enough. There we go, that's starting to have an effect. Now, as this null animates, we go to like frame 6, and the E is starting to come into focus. And as we pass that and go into the middle of the word, we have more of it coming into focus. And as it goes along, you'll see this nice sort of rippling effect as it goes across, and parts are brought into focus and parts aren't. And this is going to be a different effect than if you brought those letters in individually into a program like After Effects and applied Gaussian blur to it or something like that, because it's going to be harder to fake this feeling of distance. This is going to give you some interesting feeling of depth. Even though it's a flat graphic, you're still going to, your mind and your eyes know what depth of field is, and you're going to get that feeling by doing this. So let's save the scene real quick, and we'll show you yet another thing we can do with this. So this is Emily and Jason 1. Alright, now another thing we can do, let's kill this keyframe at the very end, and we'll put the null back at 0 so it's on the same plane as the E. Now another thing we can do, instead of having that region of focus move across the letters, we can have all the letters, the ones that are in the back, we can have them slowly come into focus, and the ones that are already in focus stay in focus. In order to do that, what we want to do is we want to select all of our letters. We're going to make sure they've got a keyframe at 0. And say on frame 60 we want them all to be in focus. Well, what that basically means is that they all need to be on the same plane as that E was. So we have to reset them back to their original positions. So let's go through all the letters, make sure that we can access our Z. Okay, we've got them all. Now we'll select them all again and reset their motion path. Let's look through the camera. Now you can see how they got bigger, so we also need to reset their size. Now they're all laid flat again, and if we render this, you can see they're all on the same plane, they're all going to be in focus. However, at the beginning, they're all out of step, and so part of it is out of focus. And as we animate through, you see there's some slight shifting in the letters because I didn't have them lined up perfectly, but that's not that big of a deal really, because you'll have this whole blur thing going on and people aren't going to notice if the letters are shifting by a pixel or two. So as you can see here, this was frame 0, and about midway through the animation it's starting to get a little bit more clear. Now you can combine this of course with an effect where we take the focus and at frame 60 we have it located in such a place where it's on the same plane as everybody and everything's going to be in focus. And then at frame 0 maybe we want it to be closer to the camera so that everything starts off out of focus like that. And then while the letters are collapsing together, the null is also moving in closer. And we get an effect where the E in Emily is still coming into focus just a little bit quicker than everything else, and yet they're all sort of slowly coming in. You can also do the same effect by having the letters flop places so that the E is farther back and the N is closer. You can go into here and you can apply dissolves to the individual letters so that not only are they blurring but they're also fading up. And I think that that would be a very nice option as well. We're going to save this one as number 2. And another thing that's kind of interesting, if we delete the keyframe for all our items here on frame 60, let's add another null. And this time we're going to parent the camera to it. And we're going to set it so that at frame 60 it's in its normal position, and at frame 0 we're going to rotate it around such that the camera is actually going to be behind all the letters, and they're going to disappear because the letters only have normals facing one direction. And now as that rotates around, the letters are going to slowly turn and come into existence. And we're also going to have the effect being applied from the digital confusion. So right now they're blurring into existence. And if we have our focus null going back to 0, and let's take all these guys, and we're going to reset their positions, reset their size at frame 60. Now, they're also flattening out as we rotate around them. So at the beginning, we're actually getting an effect where these guys are closer to the camera and they're going to be more in focus. And as we spin around, that's going to change because the camera is moving and different parts are coming into focus at different times. We can also take our null, and instead of rotating from that direction, what if we were to rotate from the other direction? So now the E in Emily is closer to us, while the N and Jason is much farther away, and yet they're going to be the first things visible. So let's see how this is going to render out. So you can see them starting to come in on the side here, and as we see more of the words, it's coming in, and I don't know about you, but this is really, this will really give you this cool sense of depth. And as it all comes together, it's gonna really be a neat effect. Until finally at the very end, when everything's in focus. And that's what we want. And then perhaps what we would do for real is this thing would fly in and kind of blur together, and it would sit there for a second. So let's take the focus, and maybe at 120 we set another keyframe, and then it's all going to fade away. So by 240 we want that null to have moved back here, so it's all blurred out again. So we're going to sort of come in, and everything's going to be in focus. And what might be kind of cool, we'll have to test this, is that the null right now is going to drift a little bit beyond, and so in the middle here, let's see, it's getting just a little soft. So if we look at it at frame 60, we get the ends are kind of soft, and in the middle, frame like 80 or so, the middle is just a little soft, until finally the null starts coming back towards us, and the whole thing is going to get out of focus and just sort of fade away into nothing. So let's save this guy as Jason and Emily and Jason 3. Okay, so we're going to take the rendered footage into After Effects to look at it. So we'll import the file. It's Emily and Jason. We'll import this sequence and make a little comp of it, and let's just do a RAM preview and see what it looks like. Alright, it's looking pretty much like what it was supposed to look like, and here we're going to fade out as it just blurs into nothingness. Alright, now this is real time. Okay, I kind of like it. I think the one thing I probably would want to do to it is maybe give it a little bit of drift right in here, so it's never quite completely settled. But I think the general effect, this whole blurring effect, is really kind of cool. I mean, in here, this is neat. That's a neat effect. And the blur out. There's other ways we could do a similar effect, and right here, the depth of field effect is not getting us that much, but here in the beginning, it certainly is. Okay, so we could probably get away with it just on black like this. I think it's got a nice classy look to it, black and white, and I think we could get away with it. But you know, sometimes you might want just a little bit more. So let's see what would happen if we were to put this over a background. I've got a scene already saved called Emily and Jason, in which I've taken this and I've used one of the backgrounds that we did on a previous DVD, and I've comped together a black solid that sort of fades out on the top and bottom, and then the Emily and Jason type on top of that using add mode. The solid's in multiply mode at about 78%, so it's never completely solid. You can sort of see just a little bit of the background in there, and it fades off to the top and bottom. We might even want to make it a little bit more by increasing the Y scale so that it's never quite completely black and there's a hint of this background back there. Another thing that I've done is I've gone in and I've stretched this background 300% in time, so it's going to be running a little slower than it normally would. For something like a wedding, you know, you're going to want it to be a little slower, a little less hyperactive and stuff. One last thing I'm going to do in here, instead of going back into Lightwave and adding a slow push on the camera, I'm going to use After Effects to do it for me, where I'll just hit S to open up the scale, and I'll make a keyframe at the very beginning at 100%, and I'll go to the very end, and I'll increase it just a little bit. You know, that might be just enough. We'll do a RAM preview on this, and we'll see. And that push is going to keep the type just breathing ever so much. And it's going to keep it from feeling a little too stagnant. I think also having a moving background back there is going to help that as well. This is a perfect time for you to be taking wedding photos and having them drift across the screen slowly, you know, combining stuff. You'd want to use this at the very opening of your package. You know, maybe instead of Emily and Jason, you say the ceremony, the reception. You know, these are good title cards. And you can see, just by putting just a little bit of a push on it, it keeps the words from locking up and being too solid. They're moving just enough. So there you go. There's some tricks for not making a wedding video look too cheesy, not getting, you know, not getting crazy with Lightwave, but still using the power of Lightwave to make your animations and make something nice. I think Emily and Jason would be very happy with this. Okay, so let's say that you're sitting around one day and someone comes up to you and they know that you're a graphics professional, and they hand you a floppy disk and they say this has got an Illustrator logo on it, and I need a 3D logo, I need it keyable, it's got to have some animation to it, and I'm going to need like a lower third bar so we can put people's names on it and stuff, because I'm going to this convention and I need it tomorrow and I don't have any money. And you go, oh, well, okay, and you open up the Illustrator file, and this is what you get. Just something like this. And if there's a real company called Orange Blossom that sells rare books, well, I'm sorry, I made this up. But this is what you got, and you have to turn this into something real. You don't have a whole lot of time, you don't have a whole lot of money. Well, what are you going to do? Well, let's go into Modeler, and I'll show you. I built something already, and I'll just kind of walk through like why I did what I did. So we'll go over here to Modeler, and we're going to load up Orange Blossom. Okay, so here's my model. And let's look at all the individual layers. We've got one layer here that's just flat text, which is Orange Blossom, and you can see I've got the eyeball turned off, so this layer is not going to load into layout. Same thing with layer 2, which is just the rare books type. When I'm working with a logo like this, I like to keep the raw flat files somewhere, usually in one of my first couple layers. And I just turn off the visibility so they never show up in layout, but I have them just in case I'm bending something and the curve goes wrong, or I need to go back and rebuild it. I I like keeping these layers around for future reference. Okay, layer 3, I've taken the rare books type. You can see I've extruded it and beveled it, and I've given it an arc. And I've done that using two separate curves that I was able to do under the Modify tab. I was able to use Spline Guide to bend the type. So that's what the rare books is. Layer 4 has this plate that matches up with the rare books underneath, and it has these little ribbons on the side that are actually three-dimensional ribbons that I've modeled using subdivision surfaces, so they're always going to be nice and curvy and smooth. And what I'm thinking when I'm building this is that I can use these ribbons later on, and I can make a lower third with that ribbon, and that sort of ties in two aspects of the same job and kind of gives you some consistency. Another thing is that this plate in here, I'm leaving this open for footage of, rare books or whatever. I can also put a background back there, or I can leave it flat and plain and just light it nicely if I want to. Since I'm not exactly sure how this guy wants to use it, I'm giving myself a little bit of flexibility by building it like this. Then layer 5 has the actual orange blossom type, and this I've bent using the spline guide again and this curve. Now if you notice, there's a difference between the way I bent the rare books, we'll zoom in on the type, and the way that I bent orange blossom. Since orange blossom is bending this way, you're actually bending the face of it. I had to split the type up into all these little sections before I could bend it. However, with the rare books type, I'm not actually trying to bend the face, I'm just sort of distorting the face, so I didn't have to slice it up. It's got plenty of points that it could bend on. Alright. And what I was trying to do when I was building this thing, this is our actual finished logo here, is I had a kind of a boring flat logo, and I wanted that to be able to live in a three-dimensional world. That's why I brought orange blossom out like this. This will give us something that we can go off of if this thing is rotating around, if we're animating it. It gives you a little bit of mystery by hiding some of the words and then bringing them into existence. It also gives us some interesting looks by really exploiting the fact that we are in a 3D environment. And yet it's not going overboard. This is a rare books company, and they don't, they're not going to want spaceships and lasers and things like that. They want something a little bit more classy, the ribbons and the, sort of the award motif or something. And I think that this will give it to them. That font that they had chosen didn't lend itself to huge extrusions and big fat bevels and things like that. So I didn't want to go overboard with it. And if you notice, all my bevels and extrusions are very small. But on the other hand, we are in a 3D environment, and I wanted to make use of them. And you can see the small extrusion that I have is enough that it's going to be, assuming that I light and surfacing this thing correctly, it's going to help make these letters pop off the background. It's doing it here even in when it's just gray and there's no lighting per se, but it keeps your letters from blending into the background too much. Okay, so that's my model, and I didn't break up orange blossom into individual layers per letter or anything like that, because I'm not really going to be animating this thing too intensely. They don't have a whole lot of money and they don't have a whole lot of time, so there's a limit to what I can do with this. So I'm not going to go crazy and and give it the same level of work that someone who's paying me $100,000 for a logo is going to give me. However, that being said, I still have things separated enough that if I wanted to do something separate with these layers, I can. Okay, so let's take this into layout now and work on surfacing it. So here's our guy. We'll move the camera in a little bit so that we can see what we're doing a bit more. Alright, now the first thing that we want to do is we're going to set up sort of our lighting situation. So let's take this light, we'll move it out here. Now we're going to go into light properties, and we're going to change it to a spotlight. Make the shadows shadow maps. Make sure you're at 1024, shadow fuzziness about 3. And then we're going to aim our light just so, and bring the cone angle down. Bring this guy up so we get, you know, some nice fall off on it. And let's see what our lighting setup is looking like so far. Okay. Now the first thing you're going to notice is that the shadow from Orange Blossom is being cast, and it's hitting this, and it's, you know, not the best looking thing in the world. I like the way that the shadows are being cast by the rare books, however. And the ribbon is probably going to look pretty cool once it's surfaced. But we know we're going to need another light just to get more things hitting and glinting and things like that. And we're going to have to do something about this Orange Blossom shadow. So what I think I'm going to do is select that object, which was layer 5, and we're going to go into render and turn off the shadow options for it. And now when we render, okay, now it's nice and clean, and it's not casting that unwanted shadow on the background. Okay, so that's good. Now let's go back, look at our light, grab our light, and we're going to clone this guy, and we're going to move it over to the other side. So we're going to move, we'll just change the sign of its X position. So now it's over there. And for rotation, we'll do the same thing. We'll just stick a negative in front of heading. So now we'll go into the light, and we'll just make sure that it's actually pointed in the right direction. And it looks like it. Let's take a render, take a look. Okay, now we're getting 2 sets of shadows on there and there, and I think that's going to look kind of nice. It's blowing everything else out, which, considering we haven't surfaced anything, you know, is probably going to be okay. So let's go in there and let's start surfacing. I'm going to start with the ribbons here. So we'll go to ribbon, we'll turn on smoothing, and we're going to make these kind of a red color, sort of a darker red. We'll give them some specularity, and then bring the glossiness down to open up that specular highlight so it's nice and broad. And you can see in the OpenGL right away that we're probably going to be getting the right kind of effect we want. We're also going to turn up color highlights, not all the way, because you can see then it just turns into a red blob, but we'll turn it up a little bit so they're not quite as bright of a highlight. Okay, that's looking pretty good. That feels kind of velvety. Feels like what I'm going for. We might want to bring down the diffuse just a little bit. That's going to make those specular highlights stand out even more. Yeah, there we go. So here's the difference. So it just gives us a little bit more contrast and makes these specular highlights pop just a little bit. Okay, now let's deal with the Orange Blossom type here. Obviously the name Orange Blossom is going to suggest that we use an orange. So we're going to give that a shot. It may not work, but then again, I'm kind of liking the fact that it feels kind of gold. We'll give it specular highlight. We'll make it pretty broad too. But we'll bring the specular down maybe about 25% or so. Turn on smoothing because those faces are smoothed across the front. See what we look like. Okay, with those 2 lights, it's really getting blown out. So we're going to have to turn diffuse down. There we go, that's looking a little better. Okay, now we need something that's going to set off the edges. So we're going to want another color. This guy, we'll take this to be a deep, dark, bluish purple, like so. For the speculars, we'll keep the speculars on this one really tight. Give it the same kind of smoothing. There you go. Now with that dark in there, that's really going to help delineate that edge. And now for the bevels, we'll take the same color as the faces and we'll just paste that onto the bevels. But we're going to bring the diffuse back up. We're going to increase glossiness a bit, so that some tight highlights. Bring up specularity so it's nice and bright. And take a look at that. Okay. Now the bevels on this one are really hard to see because they're so small. And with the level of anti-aliasing that we've got, we're really not catching it. I mean, you can't really see much of a difference. Over here by the O and the R, you can sort of catch a little bit of a difference, but not much. So to really see what we're doing, we're going to go into the camera panel and turn on anti-aliasing. We'll go medium, should be good. And we're also going to turn on limited region here. So we can close that. And this way, we'll be isolating ourselves to just that region there where we want to really see what we're doing with our bevels. Alright, there you go. It's catching a little bit of a highlight. I think what we need to do to really catch a good highlight is our normal trick with the HDR. So let's load in one of those, or the image editor. We'll load in our HDRs, and I'm going to try Beach Probe. Beach Probe has a very bright sky and then a fairly dark ground, and what it gives you is it winds up giving you a good horizon. Let's load up our black image as well, because we're probably going to need that. And we'll set these things in the backdrop. Add the image world environment. And then put the black in there in compositing. Now the thing about Beach Probe is that this one's really bright. So we're going to have to turn it down to like 35% or so. Alright. And then the other thing we have to do is go into the surface editor and actually set up our surfaces so that they're reflective. So all of Orange Blossom is going to get reflective, and we're going to use a gradient based on the incidence angle again. So that when any surface is facing us directly, it's going to be at 0 reflectivity. And when it's more of a glancing angle, we're going to be at 100%. And then, let's see. That should be it for now. So let's see how we're doing on that. Okay, so let's look at the difference here. Alright, the face is a little bit brighter because it's getting reflection from that sky. And what's happening is we're not seeing much in the way of the bevel. So let's bring that face down now. We only want it to be, say, 35% reflective. Alright, that's a little closer to what we want. And we are catching some highlights there. And we're going to be catching a few on the fronts of the faces as well, but not a whole lot. We don't want to go crazy with that. We just want enough so that it will, just see a little bit every now and then. Okay, so now let's do Rare Books. Surface Editor. And to start, let's just copy the same surfaces over from Orange Blossom over to Rare Books. I like to copy surfaces from something I've already surfaced and I'm happy with over to other surfaces in the same object, because that sort of enables me to keep within the same color palettes, and I don't have to rebuild everything that I've done. And I know that if I'm happy with this, I'll generally be happy with that. It may not be the right color, or it may not be exactly right, but it's at least a start. So let's render this and see sort of where we're at. Okay, so that's pretty good. I actually am happy with it the way that it is. It's the orange blossom type is a little bit darker than rare books because since it's bent back and it's going back in space like this, you're catching different amounts of light than rare books is. And they're in the same family, but they're different enough that it's not exactly the same. Okay, so now what are we going to do with the big open thing in the middle? Well, we certainly don't want to leave it bright white like that. One of the things that I like to do is if instead of just texturing everything, you know, like so that it's diffuse and it's specular and it gets a reflection, things like that. Sometimes it's nice to be able to, you know, apply moving textures and things onto it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to load up one of the backgrounds which we have previously rendered. So we're going to sequences, backgrounds. We use purple rings number 2. And we're going to do an automatic sizing, so that's mapped right in there. And we'll go into the image editor. We have to tell it that it's a sequence. So we'll go in here, and this guy's going to be a sequence. And just in case, we're going to turn off the alpha channel. Alright, so that's good. So let's take a look and see what this is. Okay, well that's kind of cool. This is a neat background because it kind of has the same feel as what the ribbons give us. And yet it's, you know, they're not the ribbons, they're glass. By using this background in this plate, it's giving us sort of some free animation. We didn't have to go and animate all these things undulating. We have a background already. Now the problem that we're having is that this is so well defined that it's really fighting with our orange blossom type. And your eye is going to be watching more of what's going on here, and you're not going to be able to read it quite as well. So we need to do something so that you still get a feel of the color and the motion that's going to be going on back here, but we don't want it to be quite so sharp and crisp. And luckily, Lightwave, it wasn't exactly designed to do this, but Lightwave has a really cool way of blurring out an image that you've got mapped onto something. You simply increase the texture anti-aliasing. So instead of 1, we're going to put it all the way up at 30. You can instantly see up here how blurry it is. You know, this is 1, this is 30. That's a pretty fast blur. That's 15, you know, how high can we go? 100 is going to blur it way out. Maybe 35 might be good. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so look at the difference. Very sharp and crisp, and it's kind of hard to read orange blossom, and just instantly when we blur it out, orange blossom stands out a bit more. Now here's the problem with using that texture anti-aliasing trick, is that you can sort of see some pixelization in there. Sometimes you can get away with this. If we were to reduce this from 35 to say 15, well, the effect, it's still there, but it's not quite as noticeable. It's not these big old hefty chunks like that. So another way that we can do this, we can set this back to 1. We can also blur it out in the image editor through the processing tab by adding full precision blur. Now this is a little bit slower than the other way of doing it. Just a little bit. Chances are you'll never notice it. But the problem with doing this is that now this blur is applied to this image. If you were using this image in 100 different places, they would all get blurred. By doing it here in the texture editor, you're doing it on a case-by-case basis. It's not as nice of a blur as doing it over here, but you know, you can use it at different amounts in different spots. So okay, here we go. This is with a 7 blur. You can see that's not too bad, but let's increase that. let's go up to say, let's try our 30 again. And that's going to be probably too blurry. So we'll say 15. That might be too much still, but well, no, I think that kind of works. That'll give us the same motion that background has. It's going to give us the same colors, but you can see that the orange blossom definitely stands out. Now, it's still not good enough for me. I still am kind of losing orange blossom in some places. So let's close some of this stuff. Make some space for me. And what we're going to do is we're going to open up the Objects Properties panel for the orange blossom type. And we're going to turn on edges. Turn on silhouette edges at, say, 2 pixels. Okay, 2 pixels is a little much. It's a little fat, but you can instantly see what I'm trying to do. I want that to really pop off. Take it down to 1. Okay, that's a lot better. I mean, look at the difference here. If you can't read that better, then I don't know, you got eye problems or something. Now, this is a little dark. I don't want to be using just straight black. So what I'd like to do is change my edge color from black, and I'm going to use sort of the same red that I'm using in the ribbon, but it's going to be much darker. So we'll put it in around about a 45 on red, 0 on green and blue. And this is going to be a real subtle thing. You may not notice it. It may be hard to see on the monitor there. But what it's doing is it's just giving just a little bit of red into these edges along here. Just enough so that the black isn't quite so stark. And it's helping, it's definitely helping set the whole thing off. Now, the problem with doing that now is that Rare Books looks like it needs it too. So we're going to try it on there as well. And we'll go back into the color. That was a 45 on red and 0 on everything else. Alright, there we go. Now that's looking pretty nice. Now, the last thing we want to do is we want to change this frame so it's not completely bright white. So let's open Viper here. We'll do another render test real quick. We're going to use Viper to adjust our colors and everything, well, in real time. We can click on it to select the proper surface, Blossom Bevel, and then as we change our colors, like if we wanted to make it a bright green, it's going to update right there. If we turn off draft mode, you can see it a little bit better. This will save us from having to do lots of F9s. Now I'm thinking kind of a silvery color. So it's a little bit of blue, not too much, but it's kind of a grayish color, like that. And that's a little too bright. We're going to bring down diffuse, turn up specularity, make these highlights nice and tight, turn on smoothing at 30. We'll add yet another one of our gradient maps. But instead of going all the way down to 0, I think we'll start at 15. And instead of going all the way up to 100, we'll end at 50. Okay, it's still looking a little bright. We might want to bring this down here. Bring the diffuse down a bit. And it's also looking a little gray. We might need a little bit more color to it. So let's take a look at this. Okay, well that's close. I think my smoothing angle is too high. Let's set it to 15. I'd like to catch some of the bevel that I know is supposed to be on there. Okay, well there we go. So there we go. Now we're catching a little highlight there. We're catching some along there. So I think that'll work. Now let's set it up so that we can use this as a self-keyable logo. So we'll close all these things because we don't care about this. Save our objects. We're going to save this scene. Alright. Now, if this is going to be a keyable thing that they can position anywhere on the screen, we want to make sure that we see the whole thing and that nothing's getting cut off. So we're going to move the camera back. Like that. Okay. So now we're fine there. And now we do want some motion going on. We're not flying this whole thing together or anything like that. But we do want all those glints to be able to move and cycle around. And we're going to get some animation from this inside part. But in order to get the glints, we're going to add a null. And we're going to parent everything to the null. So go to the surface editor, grab everything, parent those guys, parent the lights, parent the camera. And now, when we take the null at frame 300, rotate it 360 on everything. We'll take it out of texture shaded mode, try front face wireframe so it moves quickly. Right, so everything is rotating around this null. The HDR isn't, it's holding still. What this is going to look like is that everything is holding still and the HDR is rotating around. Your glints are going to be rotating around and hitting different parts of the object at different times, and it's going to give you a little bit of motion without actually anything moving, and it'll sort of, you know, keep this logo alive. And that's basically all you need to do. You know, you'll want to do a couple spot check renders, like this is frame 0. We'll want to do a check halfway through, around frame 150, sort of see what that looks like. And we'll want to do another one over here at 300. And you're just kind of looking to make sure that there's nothing obviously wrong. You're going to want to check frame 300 and frame 0. Make sure they look, you know, basically the same. They're going to be a little bit different because this background is animating, and so we're looking at, you know, different frames of that. But assuming you're using a background that you know loops at 300 frames, you're going to be just fine. Okay. So frame 0, frame 150, frame 300. We're not seeing a whole lot of glints going on, and I actually would like to get something going on in the ribbon. The ribbon really isn't doing anything at all. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add another null, like this. I'm going to parent that to the null that's going crazy. And I'm going to parent the two lights to that null. And this null, instead of going crazy, rotating all over the place, I'm just going to rotate it 360 degrees on its bank. So that what it's going to do is these lights are going to spin around like that. So with everything rotating like this, it's kind of hard to see what's going on to make sure that it's actually doing it right. So we'll go back to null 1, which is sort of the master world null, and just temporarily we're going to set it to 0 on its end keyframe. So we're getting rid of that motion, and we're just checking the motion on these lights. We're going to want to make sure that we look through the lights and run through everything and make sure we're not losing anything. As you can see right here, part of the ribbon is getting cut off around frame 75. So we're going to want to deal with that. Around 150 we're fine, and then again around 225 we're messed up again. So at frame 150 we're fine, so we'll set a keyframe there. And over here at 75 where we're losing everything, we're going to want to rotate the camera a little bit. And then we're going to also copy this over to frame 225 where we were having problems earlier. Like that. We'll go back to frame 0. We're going to copy that guy over to frame 300. Now open up the graph editor. Just look at our rotation channels. By selecting them and hitting Shift A, we can zoom in on them. What we want to do, set them to repeat on the pre and post behaviors, and that will let us know how well we're looping. You can see that that's not going to be the most gentle transition because we're kind of coming up hard and then coming down hard. So the very beginning keyframes and the very end keyframes, we want to set the tension to 1. And then we'll be nicely sliding through these frames. So now, light 2 always keeps the thing, for the most part, in view. We're losing a little bit right there. So maybe on this frame, we don't want to be quite so high. Let's see. Okay, now we're doing okay. So now we'll go back to light 1, and we should have to do a fairly similar thing with that one. Set frame 150, we're fine. Frame 300, we're fine. Frame 75, we need to be up here, and at frame 225, we need to be here. Go into the graph editor, isolate just the rotation channels, set it to repeat, grab the first and last keyframes, set the tension to 1, and scrub through. And we're losing a little bit up there, so let's modify that. And I think that's pretty much close enough. Alright, let's look through our camera again. We'll do a render frame 0. Okay, we'll do a render at frame 75. You can already see between 0 and 75, our ribbon is catching the light differently. Now, unfortunately, another thing that's happening is that our M is dropping off in brightness quite a bit. However, luckily enough, our edge that we had so nicely made is catching the light differently, so you can still see that the M is there. And I think with the fact that that type is not moving, I think that we're going to be okay with that. Even though the face of the M is dropping down and it's the same value virtually as the ribbon behind it, I think we'll still be okay ultimately in the long run. Alright, so now all that we need to do is go back to our master null and set its rotation back to 360 for everything, so that where everything is spinning around the whole world. And we're ready to go. We're ready to set this up. Let's save the scene. Like so. And let's take a look at the final animation. And we see here that it's animating pretty good. We're getting some good lighting changes across the ribbons. We've got glints running along the circle, along the edge of our frame. Our little background animation back there is working pretty good. And I especially like the shadows on the rare books. I like the way that, since I rotated those lights around, I like the way that those shadows are constantly moving and they're never quite still. Really gives it a good feel. So I think that looks pretty good. I mean, it's amazing that we've made that out of a simple little Illustrator file that just had some boring text to it. I think the client's going to be happy, so we're going to burn that off to a CD and ship it off to him. The animation you're seeing here for World Steel Limited was designed to be part of a commercial for World Steel Limited that this logo would run at the very tag end of their commercial. It's actually going to be shown on television and so on. And if you were to be watching TV and you see this animation and you look and you think, oh wow, that's kind of a cool look, but you have no idea how you'd go about building it. Well, I'm going to go through and sort of deconstruct the scene as I built it and sort of explain why I chose to do different things and kind of show you that there's really not a whole lot here that's different from anything that I've been teaching you the past couple DVDs. So first off, let's just look at, in general, the whole thing. It's kind of got this blue steel feel to it. It's got texture maps on here, so it's kind of brushed, and then it's got this bright sort of hot red, almost like it's iron that had just come out of the forge or something. And it's got kind of a cool, neat looking background here where everything is converging to the center. See all these pipes, they're either going around the center or they're aiming right at the center, and it draws your attention right here into the middle here where the actual words are. And limited is a hot color, so it stands off from everything, and steel slides across the word world, and all the type has a nice black edge on it to help it stand off from the rest of the animation. Then as an additional sort of highlight, we've got these sparks that keep coming out of the hot red area of the screen, and they just sort of draw your attention and sort of pound home the fact that we're talking about some steel manufacturer. And all these things sort of play along with this feeling of metal and steel and everything, and that was the goal of this whole animation. Strong, big letters, nice and thick, nice metal textures. We're really trying to hammer home this feeling of metal and steel and industrial work with the pipes and everything. So that's sort of the general idea that we're trying to get across with this animation. So let's deconstruct it, and we'll go into Modeler first and sort of look at the various objects that I used. We'll load up the object here. It's World Steel Limited. And we'll take a look at the various pieces. Now the first thing you see is that I've set up sort of a stage inside this big room here. I'll tell you why the room is there later. But I've got the word world, and that's pretty simple. There's an extrusion and a bevel, and it's a pretty thick bevel in there, and the type is pretty thick too. And I did that because I'm not looking for subtleties. I'm looking for, bold, in-your-face kind of things. I want this bevel to be obvious that it's a bevel. I don't want it to be the little dinky thing where every now and then you catch a highlight. It needs to really be there and be really, really strong. Same with the word steel. Even though it's in lowercase, I still want it to be very obvious that I've got nice large bevels on there, and those bevels are going to catch a lot of light, and they're really going to serve a good purpose for setting off the faces. Now limited is less strong. It's a little bit more, it's thinner, it has a smaller bevel. The type itself is not quite as large and impressive. And that's just because it doesn't mean as much. It's not part of the real name. It's not World Steel. It's World Steel Limited. It's kind of an afterthought. And yet we're going to texture it in a bright red so that it's, it doesn't get jealous because it's, being blended into the background. No, it's going to stand out because it has to be there. It is part of the name. But we're not going to give it quite as much emphasis as the other type. The other thing we've got here on layer 5 is our stage. This has this whole world, this big cube around it. This guy. Let's hide that for a moment and look at what else we've got. We've got a platform that's basically just a disc that's been extruded down, and then we've got all these pipes running into it. Okay, we also have these plate walls on layers 6 and 7, and they're going to be useful as background elements to kind of break up the background and not have it be completely amorphous and just go away into nothing. These are going to give us a little bit of interest and a little bit of depth at varying degrees. Okay, now back to the stage, because this is really the most important part. Inside this stage, if we select the platform and hide everything else, we've got a nice metal reflective surface on it, and along the edge and the bevel there, we're going to have, that's where that red hot edge is going to be. And that's going to give us sort of the feeling of the forge. And this circle gives us a place for everything to live. By putting it on a pedestal like this, we're really giving it a home. Like this is where you're supposed to be concentrating your attention. This is where everything is going to be happening. And we're further emphasizing that fact by taking all these pipes and running all the pipes into it. Because you have just sort of the intellectual idea of, well, if there's a pipe going to it, well, there must be something either going to there or something coming from there. This must be some hub of some sort. You also have a visual element that whenever you have converging lines, your eye tends to be drawn towards that spot where they all converge. Additionally, we have these circular pipes that go around everything and kind of frame and contain this stage where we're going to be having all the type located. And this certainly was not very difficult to build. In order to build the circular pipes, I created a bunch of discs at various locations in various sizes, and then I simply lathed them along the y-axis. That's how we would get these concentric circles. You want to change the diameter of all the discs a little bit to give you a little bit more variety, but that's basically what you're going to do. Now, to get these other ones, all these random pipes that are all pointing inwards, was even easier. Let's take, instead of a disc, let's take a box, sort of run it approximately where we want it to go. Let's zoom in on it a little bit. So we have a box running like that. Now we're going to copy that a couple times to separate layers. So on this layer, we're going to go to the Multiply tab, go to the Array button, change it to Radial, and we'll say 20 of them around the y-axis. Then on the next one, we're going to array that, and we'll make that one only 13. And then this guy, we'll array that, and he'll be 16. Okay. Now throw one of them in the background, and if we rotate using the origin as the center of our action, you rotate that so that you try not to get any of the pipes overlapping. And you cut that one, paste it on there, and make the third guy the background. Rotate those so that they're not really overlapping too much. Cut those out, paste them, and now you have this kind of random selection of pipes where in some places they're really thick, other places they're much thinner. In order to actually make them pipes instead of big square boxes, we'll cut the faces off here. We'll select all these edge faces and hide them. So all we're left is the end faces. We'll cut them as well. Bring back all the things in the middle. Hit Tab to do subdivision surfaces on them. And now zoom in and you see instant round pipes. By doing it this way, by starting with a square or a rectangular object and turning on subdivision surfaces, you're in more control over how many polygons are making these things up. Because once you set this up and array it, if you had used a disk and extruded the disk, you're sort of set with, okay, I wanted 24 or 16 or however many sides to those disks. By doing it this way, you take the basic element is just a rectangle, 4 sides, so it's not very polygon heavy. When you bring it into layout, then you're working, you can change your subdivision surface level so that if you don't have enough polygons and you're getting it kind of clunky, you can raise it up. If you have too many and it's taking too long to render, you can lower it down. Subdivision surfaces are great whenever you got anything curved. If you can figure out a way to use them, you want to use them because it gives you more control later on in rendering speed and quality. Alright, so that's basically how you would build the pipes for this stage. Now, why did I build this box all around everything? It's not just to give us a back wall. In this case, what I'm doing, if I go over to layout, I've got vector blur turned on. Vector blur has issues sometimes with alpha channels, and if you're seeing transparent information far in the back and then there's an object in front of it, you can have weird edges where it's trying to figure out, do I blur this because there's nothing there, but I know I blur this. And so by putting everything inside this box, the box is going to be moving. As the camera rotates around everything, it looks as if the box is moving as well. So the vector blur is going to be applied to that box. It's also going to be applied to the objects in front of it. And by applying it to both of them, then you get an interesting combination where around the edges they're going to wind up being highlighted a little bit more than normal. And we can see that if we look at the render on here. See how this edge is kind of highlighted a little bit? It kind of makes these objects stand out by having an object, having a wall back there. If there was nothing there, this would have just blurred off into nothingness. But by having a wall there, Lightwave is a little unsure how to blur these things together, and I'm actually using that effect, to my advantage. Alright, so now let's figure out how did we light this, and how are we working with these objects such that we get this feel of steel and cold hard metal. Well, what we've done is we really have 5 lights, and if you notice, they all have this just a little bit off white, sort of a bluish tinge to them. That's going to help make everything this cool blue color. On all my surfaces, all these metal surfaces have a nice brushed metal applied to them, both in the color channel and in all these other channels. My diffuse channel, my specular channel, my reflections channel, my bump channel. I'm using the same image and it's being applied with the same settings down here. Now, another thing I'm doing is I'm also applying it to my glossiness channel, so that where it's brighter, then the glossiness is higher, so you get a tighter specular highlight. Where it's darker, it should be more diffused. Then I invert that layer such that it's actually the opposite of that, so that in these spaces where in reality, because this is a real picture of metal, we have a light that's being diffused over a big area, we want those to be less glossy, so that your light's going to be diffused over a larger area. And then these areas where it's dark and where you don't get a highlight from the light, you want to be very tight, so that if a specular highlight were to pass over this image, then in these areas where the light, the real world light, is not hitting, like in here, we don't want that to get too blown out with this really wide diffuse specular highlight. We want it to be really tight. So that's one way to do it. And that's, I think, in this case, I think applying this map to the glossiness channel is one of the keys to the look of the metal that I was able to get. Alright, so let's do a test render real quick. You can see I'm catching highlights from the blue lights are hitting my speculars on the edge there. As it's rendering, you can see that my bump map is working down here and in here. I'm catching very bright highlights that are diffused. And now here comes my volumetric pass, which fills in everything with this atmospheric smoke and sort of brings the blue color around, just sort of makes everything tinted with that same overlaid blue color. And in order to make sure that I can read the word steel over the word world, I've applied an edge to the type, and in fact I've applied it over all of my type so that it stands out. Because with everything the same color and the same basic feel, it would be really easy for all this stuff to just get lost into a big mash. Okay, so here's a render. Right at the end, it also applied vector blur, and you can see that this object is moving by and it's got a little bit of a blur to it. And it also applied the corona effect. So it took these areas here where we're getting really bright specular highlights and reflections, and it sort of bloomed them out. Not a whole lot, because we didn't want to go crazy with it, but it blooms it out just enough that in here we're sort of getting this idea that this definitely feels like there's a bright light hitting back here. And we have all the lights focused, again, we have all the lights focused in this central area where everything is converging. It falls off and it gets darker as you go farther away. So your eye is always going to be drawn into the center here where all of our type is. Now the last thing that I added was these little particles, these little sparks here. Let's turn on limited region and focus in just on this area real quick. And I brought these in as just a little bit of an accent to try to, even though all your attention and your eye is being drawn into the center of the thing, I wanted to also delineate this circle and sort of distract you a little bit with these sparks, so that you're not just, staring blankly into the middle of this object. You need something interesting going on elsewhere that's going to kind of surprise the viewer. So that's what these little sparks are from. And to do the sparks, that's just simply a particle emitter right here. And every now and then it spurts out some particles. Now I didn't go in there and hand key a random noise function for, okay, spurt a bunch, spurt a bunch, spurt a bunch. What I did was something a little bit more tricky than that. Let's check out the properties on this emitter here. Now right now it's referencing a file that I saved for the particles, because you have to do that in order to render this over ScreenNet. So I'm going to clear the motion so I can get in and check out the settings on this generator. The main thing that I've done is on the birth rate I've applied a texture, and this texture is a crust texture based on world coordinates. So kind of what it's doing is that as the particle generator moves through space, it's as if I overlaid that crust over this entire scene. So there's places where the particle generator is going to go through a big old blob of white, and then it's going to go through a lot of black, and then another blob of white, another blob of black. Where it goes through white, it spurts out particles. Where it goes through black, it doesn't spurt out any. I'm controlling how much it's going to do based on the number that I've given in here in the birth rate, 1200, and I'm also controlling it based on this gradient. So this gradient is tightening up my crust layer, so it's increasing the contrast, so that for most of it, it's always going to be black, and there's just going to be little sections where it's going to be white. And here, instead of a value of 100, it's a value of 300, which is actually multiplying this birth rate by 3. So at regions where this crust texture is really, really white, what I'm really getting is a birth rate of 3600 coming out of 3600 particles per second coming out of the particle emitter. Now, of course, I'm not really spewing out 3600 because these regions of white that it's passing through are very small, so it doesn't have time to actually spew out that many. But what it does do is that you get nice periods, nice truly random feeling periods of absolutely nothing, and then bloop, bloop, a couple little squirts, a couple squirts. And it's just a nice sort of organic way of controlling your particles. So let's get rid of this, and get rid of this, and get rid of this. And let's take a look real quick at how I'm rendering these particles. We'll bring the particles back around so they're in the view. And under volumetrics, I'm using hypervoxels, and I'm just doing a sprite. I've got it set so that it's stretched along the velocity of the particle. So as you can see, as the particles are moving, if I show particles, now you may not be able to see them, but these particles are actually stretching along the direction that they're moving. So you get streaks as the sparks go flying. For shading, I've got a nice gold color. The luminosity has a texture applied, but its base is 500. The density is 1000. This is giving you really dense, bright particles. And our texture is a gradient based on the particle age. These particles only live for 15 frames. They start off completely non-luminous, so completely black. By frame 2, they're up at 500%, so they're very bright. And then from there to the end of their life, they're fading down to black. So what's happening is as they're being born, they're like real sparks. They're really hot right at the beginning, and then they fade out as they go. And so that's how we're doing the sparks, and they're just there just kind of as an accent on the whole thing. They're, you know, like the nuts on your sundae. You don't really need them, but they're kind of interesting. And the last thing that we need to look at is that red glow from the, you know, the forge kind of hot stuff. This guy. Well, turns out we don't have to do anything special. We don't need to turn on glow. We don't need to do anything. So all we need to do is make sure that it's surfaced properly, so it's not just a flat red. We kind of want it broken up, and then we're going to have to apply that glow to it somehow. So the base top edge is our surface, and you can see here that it's going to be broken up based on our luminosity. And we've got we've got a ball, a fuzzy blob being applied to it, and it's sort of rotating through space. And this is going to give it, this is going to keep it from being just red all over the place. It's also going to have sort of these blobs of red that go through, and then every now and then it'll be a cooler black. And then since it's a fully luminous, bright surface, then these pixels are being recognized as being extra hot by corona. So corona itself, which is the same thing that's giving us these glows around all these highlights, is also giving us the glow around the really hot metal in here. It's also responsible for the glows around our sparks. So instead of having to set up separate glow values for all this stuff, we just make sure that things are of an appropriate brightness, and corona takes care of the glows sort of in a more realistic manner. It's something that we don't have to worry about doing it case by case. You just do it once and it takes care of it. So that's basically how this thing works. There's not a whole lot to the animation of it, obviously. The camera spins around, the little sparks fly out, the word steel flies across the word world, and about 5 seconds into the animation we flip around and the camera comes back to a slightly different position and steel goes the other way. There really wasn't a need to do much more animation-wise to this, and I think by not doing too much, not having like all kinds of widgets come down, stamping things out, or arms coming in, or anything like that, we're not distracting from the importance of the actual logo itself. And since this is going to be on the screen for a relatively short amount of time, there's not a whole lot we wanted to do, to do with it, except for having some camera motion, and then every now and then we'll just break things up by completely flipping the camera around like that. So that's basically how you would build a logo like this. So let's take a look at the animation, see how it actually looks one more time. So there you go. There's some cool sort of things to keep in mind when you're designing and building your logo animations, and things that you want to keep in mind when you're watching television. You want to see what everybody else is doing. Try to see how they're using the same techniques that maybe you've learned here. You want to make sure that you're continually experimenting, and don't be afraid to use a tool in a way that's maybe not exactly the way it was designed to be used, because that's how you're going to really get the cool stuff that nobody else is doing, because nobody's thought of using it that way before. When you're building these worlds, and when you're building logos, try to reuse your props. Try to think of ways in which you can have the same sort of stage and use it somewhere else. Maybe you turn it upside down and it's a ceiling instead. Maybe it's a wall. That way, next job comes around, you've got all this material, all these props, you've got all this stuff already set up, ready to go, and you can design and you can move along much quicker. You're not starting from scratch. So, thank you for watching, and have fun building logos.